Harry Potter has returned to Alta View. We are turning our school into Hogwarts for 1 week to have an epic penny war to raise money for kids with cancer. Your class will be sorted into one of the 4 Hogwarts houses: Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, Gryffindor, or Slytherin. Here's how it works. Each day at lunch, you will find 4 cauldrons, one for each house. You put pennies in your own cauldron. They count as positive points for your team. You put nickels, dimes, quarters, and bills in other cauldrons. They count against your opponent. The house with the most points at the end of the week wins a Harry Potter-themed party. Now the sorting hat has arrived.
1,000 years or more ago, when I was newly sown, there lived 4 wizards of renown, whose names are still well known. Bold Gryffindor from Wildmoor, fair Ravenclaw from Glen, sweet Hufflepuff from Valley Broad, shrewd Slytherin from Fen. They shared a wish, a hope, a dream. They hatched a daring plan to educate young sorcerers. Thus Hogwarts School began. Now each of these 4 founders formed their own house for each, did value different virtues in the ones they had to teach. By Gryffindor the bravest were, prized far beyond the rest. For Ravenclaw the cleverest would always be the best. For Hufflepuff hard workers were most worthy of admission, and power-hungry Slytherin loved those of great ambition. While still alive they did divide their favourites from the throng, yet how to pick the worthy ones when they were dead and gone? 'Twas Gryffindor who found the way, he whipped me off his head. The founders put some brains in me, so I could choose instead. Now slip me snug around your ears, I've never yet been wrong. I'll have a look inside your mind and tell where you belong.
If your teacher is Mrs. Talbot, Mr. Scorney, Mrs. Gant, Signora Diago, Mrs. Mikshinsky, or Signor Martine, the sorting hat says you are in Hufflepuff. If your teacher is Miss Brown, Mrs. Dickey, Senorita Iglesias, Mrs. Conklin, Mrs. Malin, or Miss Shipley, the sorting hat says you are in Slytherin. If your teacher is Mrs. Cornea, Mrs. Bailey, Senora Contreras, Mrs. Cleveringa, Mrs. Little, or Mrs. Carden, the sorting hat says you are in Ravenclaw. If your teacher is Senora Jensen, Mrs. Newton, Miss Walker, Mrs. Hatton, Mrs. Johnson, or Mrs. Worth, the sorting hat says you are in Gryffindor! Woo! The war starts on Monday. Will your house win?